From podcast to video production, visit spinmediadigitalsolutions.com and bring your content to the next level.
Ya lo hace, pierna derecha, directo al arco, golazo, golazo,
The world of football with a soccer perspective. This is Soccer Today with Duane Rollins and Kevin Laramie, live on the Sports Podcasting Network.
Good day, good night, and welcome to Soccer Today for Wednesday, September 28, 2022. I'm Kev Laramie, and I'll be joined by Duane Rollins as we invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast everywhere you can, and you can follow us on Twitter at Kev Laramie for myself and at 24th Minute for Duane. Duane, busy weekend or busy international week with Canada playing twice, a 2-0 victory against Qatar in Austria, and then a 2-0 defeat against Uruguay in Slovakia. This was a busy weekend in Canadian men's national team land. We saw some interesting results. We saw also some great play by players like Kone. No minutes for Waterman. We'll break that down later in the show. But overall, if you just break down in a few different sentences, what was your thought on this window for Canada?
I think my overall thoughts in a very succinct way would be that I left it coming. I came away the way I think I intellectually knew I was going to come away from it at the start of it. I emotionally was hoping that I might be sitting here on top of the moon, top of the world. I don't know if you can be top of the moon. I guess you could be both. Excited by what it was a great performance against Uruguay. Maybe a win against Uruguay. I would have been, ecstatic by that and thinking, hey, maybe we can realistically challenge to not just get out of a group, but maybe make some noise. Like that might have been the dream, but deep down, I kind of knew where Canada was, and I think I kind of had that confirmed to me. And that's not a bad thing because I was pretty happy with where Canada was in their development cycle, and making this World Cup was their goal, and they're going to be there. So I don't think I'm neither up nor down from this. It's just kind of happy to have watched it on an intellectual level, because from now on forward, there's not going to be much intellectual about how I watch this team. It's just going to be emotional the rest until the end of December.
It's going to be raw emotional. Let's have a look at some of those results. Let's go chronologically and look at Qatar versus Canada. This took place this weekend. This was Friday in Austria, neutral site, but this was organized by Qatar. Qatar was the home team on this one. Kyle Larin scoring early on 4th minute. He scored his country-leading goal, being the best scorer in the history of this country for now, until Jonathan David, who scored the next goal, will surpass him in the next few years. Jonathan David, 13th minute, scored for Canada to make it 2-0. Here are a few numbers. Canada 61% possession, 92% passing accuracy. Great performance by Samuel Piette in the midfield, I have to say, for our Montreal listeners. This was eye-opening. Yes, at some moments it wasn't as easy versus Uruguay for a few players, but against Qatar, Canada looked good.
Yeah, well, yes, Canada did look good. They scored the 2 early goals. They hit a crossbar a couple times. It was a pretty good performance, top to finish. Now, I think it should be noted that Qatar was pretty dreadful in this window. They lost to the Croatian under-23s, so it's not particularly much to write home about. And this team seems to be going backwards. I have some thoughts on that. Perhaps, Qatar, we know that they're not necessarily. Well, they have problems there in terms of how they treat people, and I'm wondering whether some of the folks that came in might not be treated right. That's speculation based on the performance of Qatar now versus a couple years ago.
In this window, so Duane's referring to Tuesday, September 20th, when they lost 3-0 to Croatia under 23. Then they lost 2-0 to Canada on September 23rd. And then yesterday, which was the 27th, Qatar played against Chile. It was 2-0 for Qatar. And then they conceded twice. It finished 2-2 between Qatar and Chile. So Qatar winless this window.
and a very experimental Chile, we should mention too. Chile, of course, not qualified for the World Cup, so they're kind of, they're blooding into new players there. So not a great window for the hosts, and we'll see how they do moving forward. We'll obviously preview them when we talk about this tournament closer to it happening.
Well, quickly, when I can say that in Qatar's group, in Group A, Ecuador, Senegal, and the Netherlands will be their opponents, and they will play the first game on November 20th.
Yeah, exactly. And the Dutch look very good in this window, so we'll watch that with interest. Canada, look, it was a great performance against a team that we wanted them to take it out to them. We wanted them to control the play, to dictate the offensive attack, to not give up any chances, and they ticked all the boxes there. And they got what was a very solid win against a team that they are ranked above, and they showed that they are better than. It set themselves up for the game we'll talk about next, where it was a different result, obviously. The mirrored result.
Exactly, just the different teams. Just before we move on, which this does apply to both games, honestly, in the selection of the team and the tactical setup of John Herdman's Canadian men's national team, a 3-4-1-2 to start the game, a formation that is not necessarily a go-to for Canada over the last few years under John Herdman. We've seen the 3-5-2, if you want to call it this way, a few times. We've seen the 3-person backline or 5-person midfield, depending on the situation, a few times. But this was a different one with Alphonso Davies used as a 8, if you want to use it that way, or some 10 sometimes, so it's referring to. But what did you think of John Herdman tactical choices? They were similar for both games, having just a couple of changes in between. What was your thought on John Herdman, the tactician, heading into Qatar and Uruguay game?
Yeah, well, it's going to be hard for me to answer that question without referring to the Uruguay game because I don't think he made some mistakes there, or at least wasn't adjusting fast enough on the Uruguay game. In terms of Qatar, to keep with that for a moment, as I said a moment ago, this was a game that Canada needed to dictate. Qatar was sitting back. They had to break them down. They were able to do so, and I think that's a positive thing. Now, against Uruguay, I think Uruguay controlled that tactically, and bluntly, I think John Herdman was outmanaged. Uruguay wanted to neutralize Canada's greatest weapon, which is that sort of dynamic speed. They allowed Canada the ball, thinking that Canada would not be able to break them down through movement, and they were right. Canada didn't really move off the ball fast enough, wasn't moving the ball fast enough, weren't getting in positions. When they were getting into good cross positions, there wasn't a lot of targets for them. If you looked at that, there was a lot of possession. We'll talk about that in more detail in a minute, but it wasn't great possession outside of a couple chances that were created off either a giveaway. I'm thinking the Richie Laryea miss, or what was a nice little turn with the Jonathan David turn, which was the best chance of the game, where he did force the big save there too.
At the 63rd, yes, at the 63rd minute in the game against Uruguay.
Yeah, and the Stefan Sakiu free kick would be the other one, which again was created off of a foul. So I think in general, when the play was dynamic, when they were the runner play, Canada was having a lot of the ball, and they were doing some good things. They were trying some good things, but they weren't necessarily able to have that sort of last-minute adjustment to allow them to take advantage of the assets they have. And I have to put some of the blame on Herdman for that. And I'm sure he does too, because he's someone who constantly watches and thinks and reviews performances. So I'm sure that he will have been reviewed that and will be critical of himself as well. But I'm going to go out and say that it wasn't his best performance, particularly in the first half against Uruguay, where they really did outclass Canada in that first half. I will fight anyone on that one. The second half, we could have a conversation. You could have a different take on that. That's fine. But that first half was a masterclass on how to neutralize something that a power in another team, and why, an example 1A of why having a lot of the ball isn't always the be all end all.
Oh no, exactly. And when you see players like Darwin Nunez off of set pieces or aerial duels dominate Canadian players with, of course, his size, but also his awareness in space where he is and what he can do towards the ball. And he got close, and then eventually he scored at the 33rd minute off a cross from Luis Suarez. And Nicolas de la Cruz actually started that whole play. It was similar to a play that happened just 5 minutes earlier that led to a missed chance. They saw that this was the opening, and they telegraphed a move, and nobody from Canada adjusted. Alyssa Johnston was a defender getting beat on the move, but not the only one. It was going quickly. Uruguay, 13th in the world, and of course one of the powerhouse in history of the beautiful game. This was a wake-up call, and of course, looking at some of the numbers, 56% possession for Canada, but it doesn't mean anything when the 3 shots on target, one was clear-cut, I would say, a chance. The rest are just numbers because Uruguay doesn't really care about all those numbers. It's international soccer, and it has a different feel where it's a short sample size, right, Duane? So the only number that really matters is the box score.
Yeah, I mean, look, in Uruguay, let's face facts here for a second. And I don't want to be Debbie Downer completely. And again, I want to reiterate that I don't walk away from this window negative about Canada's chances in the World Cup. I walk away with them feeling the same as I did before at the start, right? Like it didn't improve, they didn't decrease. But Uruguay, they're coming at this from a different perspective. They likely are thinking about this in the sense of an opportunity for them to practice something. I think in particular, after they had the 2-goal lead, you can call it score effect or you can call it a tactical decision to work on defending. Either way, they clearly were not interested in getting front foot in the second half. And that, I believe, was by a choice. That's my theory on that. There's no way to prove that unless you're inside that dressing room. But it certainly didn't look like they were much interested in going forward. It certainly looked like they felt that they had the couple goals there and that it was an opportunity for them against a decent opponent in their mind to work on some defensive side of the things, which will benefit them in a World Cup. So you can't really look at the game purely. Now, you mentioned the possession difference. Now, first off, I think a lot of people, particularly if you were listening to the commentary, would have thought that Canada had a hell of a lot more than 56% of the ball because they were, there were suggestions out there that they were dominating or they were taking the game to them. That's a pretty normal possession difference there. And then I look at the passes made, and there's not a big enough gap to represent that, right? Like they're having balls, but they're not really doing anything penetrative with the passes. It's really not a great advantage there. They're not creating anything with that possession in any true sense. Now, that's not a bash on them. Uruguay is a better team. They're ranked where they are for a reason. They've been in multiple World Cups recently. They've been deep in World Cups recently. This is a better team right now. And Canada did well to perform as well as they did, but they are a bit behind them, and that is going to be indicative of what we're likely going to see in Qatar, which was always going to be the case. I haven't given up hope that they might be able to pull an upset there, but this is a wake-up call, and it's better to happen on September 27th than it is on November 27th.
Which I don't want to belabor this and make it a formation conversation here, but I guess I am, and this maybe is going to be a segment down the road, the formation conversation with Kevin. And as we go on a water lounge type of feel, we're going to have a conversation about formation. 4-4-2 is used by teams like Uruguay, and it has been the new fashion trend in international soccer. Nothing new here. 4-4-2 has been maybe the most used formation in history when we're looking at soccer. It was almost even present back in the early days, in the early 1900s. But Canada, over the last few months, have gone with the 4-4-2 and now away with the 4-4-2 for a more offensive and, I would say, sideline-based, corridor-based, use whatever you like, the width, the wing backs, using the side of the field a lot. But internationally speaking, teams can adjust like Uruguay did. Should Canada have a different relationship with how they set up? They tried Davies in the midfield for this one. It was interesting. I'm wondering what Canada needs to do to have themselves set up maybe a bit more solidly defensively.
Yeah, I mean, look, when the second goal in particular, unfortunately, because of the problems One Soccer had with the feed, we weren't able to see the build up to the first goal, so I can't really comment on it beyond the free kick itself, which I had what was a great way for me to get the feedback on other means. Is I turned on immediately to watch the free kick go in. But at any rate, when it came to that first goal allowed, there was Alistair Johnson was beat, but that's not his strength, right? So to have him isolated in that is the issue there. So they need to make sure that they're covering for a lack of air presence in that regard, as he is in Montreal. So something broke down there, and they have to work on. When it comes to Canada formation-wise, and first off, the caveat here being that I will never, ever present myself as an expert on formations, but I do watch a lot of football. I would suggest that they need to find a way to get their skill players moving with the ball at speed, and I don't necessarily think that they were able to do that. And now, others that are better at formations and have more coaching badges than me might be able to figure a way to do that. But that I would say that in a very basic term. If you're static, which they were, they're going to struggle to break down those big teams. But if they come at them with speed, as we saw in qualifying against good teams in Mexico and the United States, Costa Rica, then they can have some success. So how do you do that? It's up to John Herdman.
And it'll be interesting to see how John Herdman adjusts from these two games to the next game Canada will have, and that is against Japan, the last friendly before the World Cup in November. We will take a short break. When we come back, we will look again more closely at some of the other results in the international friendlies, some of the results even in the Nations League, as both Belgium and Morocco and also Croatia played last week, and we will be right back after this short break.
You are listening to Soccer Today. Follow us on Twitter at SoccerTodaySPN and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network.
We're back on Soccer Today as we now look to our patrons and thank them for their great support. You can support our patrons and become a member of the Shoutout tier at patreon.com/2solitudes, and you can join like Gonzalo, Danielle, Ian, let's not forget Let's Go Boys himself, Blue Collar Dan, and Sean, and other great human beings on our Patreon page at patreon.com/2solitudes. 2. The number 2. 2 is also the number of goals allowed by the U.S. men's national team against Japan last Friday. Matt Turner, formerly of New England, now at Arsenal, conceded 2 goals, and the USA got beat by the Samurai 2-0, and they also drew Saudi Arabia 0-0, a window without goals for the U.S. men's national team.
Yeah, which is your headline. But I do think from another perspective, and obviously we have a lot of listeners that have different types of national allegiances beyond Canada or the United States. If you're a Japanese fan out there, you got to walk away from that game feeling pretty happy, because that was a really, really good performance by Japan. They absolutely slapped the U.S. down in that. I mean, 8 shots on target versus none. That's a pretty one-sided performance. And if it wasn't for Matt Turner, it could have been a much uglier scoreline than 2-0. I think it's fair to say. I doubt there would be many Americans that would argue me in that point. I've read the Twitter right now. There would be none. There's a lot of anger in U.S. circles right now. Japan was the better team. There's not much to say in that. But when you look at that Saudi Arabia game and you look at how they approached it, the Saudis, I'm saying, they sat back, they defended deep. They didn't really look to get out and do much on the attack, but the U.S. just could not create anything of note in that game.
And before there's any criticism, the U.S. must have rotated and put a backup squad. Let's look at the names that were playing, because they were recognizable names, Duane. Christian Pulisic, Ricardo Pepi, Gio Reyna, Kevin Acosta, Tyler Adam, Weston McKennie, Sergino Dest, Aaron Long, Walker Zimmerman, DeAndre Yedlin, and Matt Turner. Almost all those players will have a start at the World Cup or close to it. This was not a C lineup. This was close to a lineup with the players available that they went with.
No, that was the U.S.'s lineup. I mean, they played players that are going to play in the World Cup. This is not an experimental situation here. Look, I've always said before, if we can pat our own back here for a minute, that in many ways, listening to us break down U.S. games is better than listening to U.S. podcasts, because we're in Canada. We don't have an emotional connection to the team in the same way that Americans do, but we do have an understanding of this team that's very close to Americans. I'd say better than most Americans, because I cover MLS every day, right? So we know these players quite well. We know the U.S. pool very well. If I was an American fan, I normally think that they're overreactive when it comes to losses and poorer performances. I would say that the reaction's pretty on the nose at this one. It was a dreadful window, and it's got to be concerning, because not so much the results, you can have bad windows, but the way that they seem to regress. They went.
You're right. Where are they going to find the goals? Offensively speaking, I'll take Canada any day. Any day.
It would, yeah, no, I would take the Canadian pool. Like maybe there's no maybe, but the U.S. is much deeper. But
I'll take Walker Zimmerman. I'll take Aaron Long, and heck, give me DeAndre Redlin. But I'm keeping the rest for Canada.
Well, I mean, yeah, you say Aaron Long, but there's a lot of American USMNT fans out there that because he plays in MLS that are going to be upset about that. Now, I'll definitely take Aaron Long at TFC next year, but that's a topic for the offseason in our MLS shows. Look, what I meant by regression, though, is that if you remember back to Greg Berhalter's earlier part of his tenure when he first came in, and they were trying very much to always play out of the back and to play in a certain way and Dippler like dogmatically approach games without necessarily looking for results first. He seemed to go back to that, and it didn't necessarily look great. Particularly the first goal that Japan allowed was basically mistakes coming from the back, and it's not necessarily a great sight to see 2 months out of a World Cup. But you nailed to take this down to the brass tacks. It really is the lack of a 9, which is a problem that U.S. fans have been talking about. Since Josie's form started to go sideways. What was that, like 2017?
Well, it's true. So it's been 5 years since the U.S. can say they have a top-tier striker that is, how do you call it? A pendant player, penciled-in players where he's going to play every single game. You're Jonathan David. There's no Jonathan David, for lack of other comparison, for U.S. men's national team at this point. And this is a big point of contention heading into the World Cup, where it's not necessarily going to be a walk in the park, but who was your top striker? When you look at the Pulisic, the Pepe, the Rena, all of those 3 players are struggling to get playing minutes with their top team in Europe right now. We're looking at a situation where there's no clear-cut number 1, number 9, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, look, this is when you get into the conversations about Josh Sargent and other players in the U.S. player pool that are playing at a decent level, that haven't necessarily been favored in the past or at all, maybe getting a look. But when you're trying to break someone in to a system that they haven't really played in a whole lot and haven't really been part of this setup a whole lot this close to a World Cup, you're really at that point grasping at straws, right? True. Like, it's not great.
No, and looking at the next games for the USA, because it hasn't been announced the other maybe upcoming, I would say, warm-up game. So next game for the U.S. is a World Cup game. It is Group B, match day number 1 against Wales. And then they have England on November 25th, and they finish with Iran on November 29th. If you are Wales and Gareth Bale, this is not a stupid choice. Gareth Bale decided to come to USA to play in LAFC and look at some of the defenders of the U.S. men's national team. And then on November 21st, out of nowhere, Gareth Bale is going to play 90 minutes. He's going to score 3 goals, and he's going to shock the U.S. men's national team fans. And then on November 25th, England. That's not an easy test. And then Iran. Iran could shock the world too. Let's not take them too lightly. This is not going to be easy. The World Cup, there's no easy game, and also no place to hide.
Yeah, well, Iran is going to play very defensive. Their manager is someone who's known for his ability to shut down games, and we've saw it in this window. Now, look, before I go any further, I do want to note that we are, of course, talking about a country and a team that is under a cloud of darkness right now when it comes to protests and sort of human rights issues there. I don't want to discount that, but this is a football show, so to keep it on that. That's a tough game for the U.S. in terms of breaking that team down. They can't break Saudi Arabia down. I think Iran's a better team. So that's going to be something that's going to be challenging for them. I don't know where American fans, and I'm trying to be diplomatic in how I say this, there is a consensus out there that England game that they view it as this is an opportunity to take a scalp. And part of that's just the American bravado, which is kind of abnormal at times, right?
Sure,
like they believe they're problem of anything. But I don't think there's much
Sorry, go ahead.
Evidence behind it in this case.
No, I agree. To me, it's an opportunity to lose a big game.
Yeah.
That's what it's going to be. It's an opportunity to have England have their own Boston Tea Party and have insert your own your own revolution joke here.
Yeah, and look, we should note England did not have a great Nations League. Now, I don't put any stock. Like that mean phrase that again to make sure I don't put any stock in the Nations League results in Europe right now, because it's a weird competition in the sense that a big part of it took place in that June window, which didn't matter. Like that June window does not matter. They were playing it for the sake of playing it. Players didn't want to be there. I'm not going to put any stock in it. England didn't look particularly good outside of 20 minutes in this particular window either. So they're not exactly firing, but they are a team that went to a European final and to a World Cup semifinals. Yes, they had an easier draw in the World Cup in particular, but they're still a better team, more accomplished team than the United States. It would be a significant upset for the U.S. to get a result in that game, which comes down to that Welsh game. And yeah, I just don't see the U.S. getting out of this group. Sorry, American listeners, but I don't see Canada getting it either before you come at me with it. So there you go. This, I think, might be when you look at these, and you look at Mexico as well and Costa Rica, this is a down cycle for the CONCACAF teams across the board, other than Canada, which speaks to why Canada won the CONCACAF qualifying, because they were going up and the rest of them, I think, were going down a bit. So
we'll see. I agree with you. I am not as bullish on Canada beating Croatia, but I am also as high, if not even higher, on Canada beating Morocco. To me, that's very possible. Morocco, just earlier this week, yes, it was a June window and it doesn't mean anything, but Morocco lost 3-0 to the U.S., the same similar U.S. team that lost to Canada in qualifying. So I do believe Canada's got some legitimacy in thinking they can beat Morocco. Then it becomes a praying situation against Belgium and Croatia. But the Morocco game, at that point, you already know the situation. So it could be interesting there. But got some ways to go before this happens. And next for Canada is that Japan friendly in Qatar just a couple days before the beginning of their first World Cup since 1986.
Look, when it comes to the Japan friendly, I think that's really great that they have that friendly booked. It's going to provide a team, having watched them play the U.S., that is not going to sit back similar to Uruguay. They're not going to try and neutralize Canada. I don't believe anyway. Try to neutralize Canada's strengths the way that they did, and instead is just going to go out and work on their own stuff and play, which I think is similar to how Belgium will approach the game. So it is an ideal preparation in my mind to go into that Belgium game. And as ironic as this is, considering the rankings of the teams in the tournament, I do think that Canada has a better chance to beat Belgium than they do Croatia. That Croatia game terrifies me bluntly, but we'll see. Croatia's very good and are a dark horse in this tournament again. Yes, they have older players, but those older players are Luka Modric, for God's sake. So let's be respectful of that and what they've accomplished in the past. It's a good team, but Belgium is going to play with them, and Belgium has kind of a slower-footed guys at the back, and they weren't really able to do much to other than Kevin De Bruyne. They aren't always able to do much, and look, Kevin De Bruyne, if you give him space at the top of the box, which we saw against Uruguay, he's going to kill you. So Canada's got to figure that out. But, if they could get a couple games, they get a couple breaks in that one, I could see it. I mean, they would require a bounce. And when I say a bounce, like severe bounces, like weird stuff would need to happen. But weird stuff happens in a World Cup, particularly in the first game for teams. So that one to me is the one you circle. You get a result in that, then game on. If you lose that Belgium game, you really have to regroup fast. It's a quick turnaround too. I mean, it's only 5 days between the games. So yeah.
It's also a quick turnaround between when players will stop playing in their team and heading into the World Cup. There's not as much time in a camp, and it's very quick turnaround between the club game to the World Cup, which will be very soon. On that note, you can follow Duane on social media at 24th Minute, myself at Kev Laramie, and this show at Soccer Today SPN. Make sure you follow our Twitter feed. That's when you'll be notified whenever we upload a new podcast, a new YouTube video, and more. And of course, stay tuned to our social media platform to know our deepest thoughts on the beautiful game. But as always, until next time, for Duane Rollins, I'm Kev Laramie. We wish you a great soccer.
You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.